Sarah Miller's heels clicked frantically against the airport terminal floor as she raced through the crowded corridor, her carry-on bag bouncing against her hip. Her phone buzzed for the 5th time, another missed call from the babysitter. Documents from her briefcase scattered across the floor when she tried to check the time, causing her to drop to her knees, gathering papers while muttering under her breath. Final boarding call for Flight 2317 to Boston, the overhead speaker crackled. Her heart pounding, Sarah reached Gate 23, just as the gate agent was preparing to close the door. "Wait, please," she called out, waving her boarding pass. "I'm here." The agent looked at her watch with disapproval. "You're cutting it extremely close, Ms. Miller. We were about to close the flight." "I know, I'm sorry," Sarah said, catching her breath. "My meeting ran late and then traffic." She trailed off, knowing excuses wouldn't matter. As the agent checked her boarding pass, Sarah noticed an elderly man sitting alone by the window. He wore a neatly pressed suit that seemed a size too large for his thin frame, and his eyes held a distant, melancholic look as he watched planes take off into the evening sky. What caught her attention was the military medal pinned to his lapel. It looked exactly like the one her grandfather kept in a velvet box on his mantel. The boarding process was chaotic, with passengers struggling to fit oversized bags into overhead compartments. Sarah noticed the elderly man again, now standing in the aisle, staring at his window seat with obvious discomfort. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked. He turned, offering a weak smile. "Oh yes, well, these old legs don't move like they used to. Getting to the window is a bit of a challenge these days." Without hesitation, Sarah looked at her own aisle seat and made a decision. "Would you like to switch? I have an aisle seat in 14D. The relief in his eyes was immediate. "Are you sure? That's very kind of you, young lady." "Of course, I'm Sarah Miller," she said, extending her hand. "James Cooper," he replied, his handshake firm despite his age. "I truly appreciate this." As they settled into their new seats and the plane began its takeoff roll, light turbulence sparked a conversation. James gripped the armrest, chuckling nervously. "Never quite got used to flying, even after all these years." "Do you fly often?" Sarah asked, noticing how his other hand unconsciously touched the medal on his lapel. "Not anymore. Used to, though. Back in '69, we flew everywhere in Vietnam. Different kind of flying then. Much lower, much more dangerous." His eyes took on that distant look again. "My buddy Frank and I, we were always together on those flights. Best friend I ever had." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her grandfather's name was Frank, and he'd served in Vietnam. She studied the medal more carefully now. It was identical to her grandfather's, down to the specific unit markings. "Were you part of the 173rd Airborne Brigade?" she asked carefully. James's eyes lit up. "Why, yes. How did you know?" "The medal looked familiar," she said, her heart racing as James pulled out an old, worn wallet. "Look here," he said, showing her a yellowed photograph of 2 young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. "That's Frank and me just before—" He paused, his finger tracing the edge of the photo. "Just before the explosion that changed everything. April 17th, 1969. Never saw him again after that day." At that moment, while James began to tell the story of the explosion that changed everything, Sarah realized she was sitting next to the man her grandfather had believed dead for 50 years. Sarah's hands trembled as she watched James carefully return the photograph to his wallet. The plane had reached cruising altitude now, the seatbelt sign dimming with a soft ding that seemed to echo in her mind. "The strangest thing," James continued, his voice growing softer, "is that I can still hear the helicopter rotors from that day. We were supposed to secure a landing zone near Pleiku. Frank insisted on taking point, but He stopped, swallowing hard. "I should have been the one to go first." The beverage cart rattled down the aisle, breaking the tension momentarily. Sarah declined the flight attendant's offer, But James asked for water, his hands shaking slightly as he accepted the plastic cup. "You know," he said after taking a sip, "I've never told anyone this story. Something about you reminds me of those days. Maybe it's because you're about the same age my granddaughter would be, if I had one." Sarah watched as he pulled out another photograph, this one more damaged than the first. It showed a group of soldiers standing before a helicopter, their faces young and serious. Her breath caught as she recognized her grandfather standing in the center, his arm thrown casually over James's shoulder. "That was our unit," James explained. "The day before we shipped out to the Highlands. Frank had just received a letter from home. His wife was expecting. He was so excited, couldn't stop talking about being a father." He smiled sadly. "I always wondered if it was a boy or a girl." Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. She knew the answer. Her mother had been born 3 months after that photo was taken. She wanted desperately to tell him, to bridge the 50-year gap right there in seat 14D, but something held her back. The weight of history and unspoken words hung heavy in the recycled air of the cabin. James's fingers traced the edge of the photograph, lingering on the faces of men long gone. "Sometimes I think I should have looked harder after the explosion, but they told us the sector was overrun, that there were no survivors in that area. I spent 2 weeks in a field hospital, and by the time I got out," he shook his head, "the war has a way of scattering people like leaves in the wind." Sarah watched as he carefully tucked the photographs away, noticing how his hands lingered on each one as if saying goodbye all over again. She reached for her phone, intending to take a picture of him to show her grandfather, only to find it dead, the black screen reflecting her frustrated expression. "It's funny," James said, looking out at the clouds below, "how life gives you these moments of clarity when you least expect them. I haven't spoken about Frank in years, and here I am, telling his story to a stranger on a plane." He turned to Sarah with a gentle smile. "Thank you for listening, young lady, and for the seat switch. My old bones are grateful." Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. As the plane began its initial descent, she watched James close his eyes, his hand resting protectively over the pocket where he'd stored the photographs. The metal on his lapel caught the late afternoon sun, sending a brief flash of light across the cabin, a mirror image of the one that sat in her grandfather's velvet box, waiting to be reunited with its twin. Sarah's hands trembled as she processed what she had just discovered. The elderly man sitting next to her wasn't just any veteran. He was the soldier her grandfather had mourned for half a century. She watched James from the corner of her eye as he continued his story, careful not to reveal her racing thoughts. "Frank and I were inseparable back then," James said, his weathered fingers tracing the outline of his military medal. "He was more than just my brother in arms. He was my best friend." Sarah's mind flashed to the old photograph on her grandfather's mantel, 2 young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling despite the mud and fatigue etched on their faces. She'd grown up seeing that photo, hearing stories about the friend who never made it home, except he had made it home, and now he was sitting right next to her. "We had this last mission together," James continued, his voice growing softer. "It was supposed to be routine reconnaissance, but nothing was ever routine in Nam." A flight attendant appeared with the beverage cart, momentarily interrupting the conversation. Sarah used the break to collect her thoughts, watching as James politely declined a drink. His hands shook slightly as he reached into his wallet, pulling out a worn photograph. "This was us about a week before." His voice trailed off as he handed her the photo. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There was her grandfather, young and strong, standing next to James in front of their unit's helicopter. She recognized the scene from her grandfather's own copy of the same photo. "The explosion happened so fast," James said, his eyes distant. "I made a mistake. I gave the wrong coordinates. I should have double-checked." He clutched his medal tightly, knuckles turning white. I always assumed Frank blamed me. How could he not? Sarah reached for her phone, desperate to call her grandfather, but the battery indicator flashed red before going dark. She fumbled in her bag for her notepad, jotting down details while James dozed off briefly, his hand still gripping the metal. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting James awake. He quickly tucked the photo back into his wallet, his previous openness disappearing behind a wall of painful memories. Sarah watched as he turned toward the window, the weight of 50 years of guilt visible in the slope of his shoulders. "We were like brothers," he whispered, almost to himself. "I should have looked for him after I recovered, but I couldn't face him. Not after what happened." Sarah wanted to scream that her grandfather had spent decades blaming himself too, believing he had left his best friend to die. The truth was so close, yet so delicate. One wrong word could shatter this fragile moment forever. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent. James straightened his seat, carefully folding away his memories with his tray table. Sarah watched as he transformed back into the quiet, elderly man she'd first noticed at the gate, all traces of his painful confession hidden behind a polite smile. The plane touched down, and Sarah felt time slipping away like sand through her fingers. She had mere minutes to decide whether to reveal the truth or let this extraordinary coincidence fade back into the past. The plane touched the ground, and Sarah realized she had only minutes to decide whether to reveal the truth or let this story get lost in time once again. The landing gear touched down with a jolt, and Sarah's heart raced as she watched James methodically gather his belongings. He moved with the deliberate care of someone who had spent decades creating routines to keep painful memories at bay. "Thank you for listening to an old man's stories," he said softly, not meeting her eyes. "Sometimes it's easier to talk to strangers." The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began the usual rush to retrieve their overhead luggage. Sarah's mind whirled with possibilities. She could show him the matching medal her grandfather kept, could pull out her family photos, could tell him the truth right there in the narrow airplane aisle. "Mr. Cooper," she started, but her voice was drowned out by a child crying 3 rows back. James was already standing, his tall frame stooped as he reached for his small carry-on bag. "You're very kind," he said, stepping into the aisle. Just like Frank was. He always looked out for others, too. Sarah fumbled with her own bags, trying to keep pace with him as passengers pushed past. She watched his gray head moving toward the front of the plane, her opportunity slipping away with each step. The flight attendant's cheerful, "Thank you for flying with us," barely registered as she hurried after him. The jet bridge seemed endless, James's measured steps carrying him further away. She saw him check his watch, adjust his jacket, square his shoulders, the movements of a man preparing to retreat back into his solitary world. "Mr. Cooper, wait!" she called out, but a large family with crying twins chose that moment to step between them. By the time she maneuvered around the chaos, James had disappeared into the terminal's crowded corridor. Sarah stood at the mouth of the jet bridge, watching the spot where he had vanished, the weight of unspoken truths heavy in her chest. Somewhere in this airport, a man who had carried 50 years of unnecessary guilt was walking away, still believing his best friend would never forgive him. She pulled out her dead phone, staring at the black screen that held her connection to her grandfather. Somewhere across the city, another old soldier sat in his favorite chair, looking at a photograph of a friend he believed had died decades ago, carrying his own burden of guilt for leaving him behind. The plane touched the ground, and Sarah realized she had only minutes to decide whether to reveal the truth or let this story get lost in time once again. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the passengers file out of the plane. James had disappeared into the sea of travelers, his silver hair and military medal lost among the moving bodies. She clutched her carry-on bag tightly, trying to push through the crowd while keeping her eyes fixed on where she'd last seen him. The baggage claim area buzzed with activity, luggage spinning endlessly on the carousel. Sarah scanned every face, every corner, hoping to catch a glimpse of James. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Another call from Claire, her daughter's babysitter. I know, I'm late," Sarah answered, her voice tight with tension. "Something important came up. I'll be home as soon as I can." As she hung up, a memory flashed through her mind. Her grandfather, Frank, sitting in his favorite armchair, tears streaming down his weathered face as he spoke about the friend he'd lost in Vietnam. She'd been 12 then, too young to fully understand the weight of his grief. Now, decades later, that same friend had been sitting next to her on a plane, alive and bearing the same wounds of separation. Sarah rushed to the information desk, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Excuse me, did you see an elderly gentleman pass through here? Silver hair, military medal, navy blue blazer?" The attendant shook her head, but Sarah caught movement from the corner of her eye, a familiar figure heading toward the exit. "James!" she called out, but her voice was lost in the airport's cacophony. She ran, dodging travelers and their luggage, her bag bouncing against her hip. Just as she reached the automatic doors, she saw him climbing into a yellow taxi. Sarah fumbled for her phone, managing to snap a photo of the license plate just as the car pulled away from the curb. She stood there, catching her breath, watching the taxi disappear into the evening traffic. Her phone rang again, her mother this time. Sarah answered, leaning against a concrete pillar. "Mom, you won't believe what just happened," she began, her voice shaking. "I met Grandpa Frank's friend from Vietnam, the one he thought died in the explosion. He's alive." Silence filled the line before her mother spoke. "Are you sure, honey? That was so long ago?" "I'm positive. He had the same medal, knew all the details." "Mom, should we tell Grandpa?" "I don't know, sweetheart. That's a lot of history to unlock. It could bring back painful memories." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the way James had clutched his medal when speaking about the explosion. Both men had carried their guilt for half a century, each believing they'd failed the other. Back in her car, Sarah pulled out her laptop and started searching. James Cooper, Vietnam veteran, yielded thousands of results, but one caught her eye, a local Veterans Association article from 3 years ago. There he was, standing with other veterans, that same medal gleaming on his chest. The sun was setting as Sarah wrote down the association's address, determination setting in. She had witnessed too many of her grandfather's quiet moments of grief to let this opportunity slip away. Whatever had kept these two men apart for 50 years, she was going to fix it. As she started her car, Sarah thought about how a simple seat exchange had led to this moment. That wasn't just coincidence. It was a chance to heal wounds that had festered for far too long. With only a name and a medal as clues, Sarah knew she had begun a mission that could either heal or destroy decades of family history. Sarah pulled into the nearly empty parking lot of her apartment complex, her mind racing with possibilities. She needed a plan, a way to approach this delicately. The Veterans Association wouldn't open until morning, and every minute that passed felt like a missed opportunity. Inside her apartment, she found Claire dozing on the couch, her daughter Emma's favorite stuffed animal still clutched in her hands. Sarah quietly paid the babysitter and checked on Emma, who was sound asleep in her bed, before settling at her kitchen table with her laptop. She spent hours diving deeper into military records and social media, piecing together James's life after Vietnam. There were fragments everywhere, a mention in a local newspaper about a Veterans Day parade, a photo from a military reunion in 2019, a listing as a board member for a veterans support group. At 3 a.m, Sarah found herself staring at an old black-and-white photograph on a military history website. James and her grandfather stood side by side, arms around each other's shoulders, their young faces beaming with confidence and brotherhood. The caption read, 44th Infantry Division, 1972, Da Nang. She printed the photo and placed it next to one taken at her grandfather's 80th birthday last year. The contrast was stark, not just in the obvious aging, but in the eyes. Her grandfather's recent photo showed a happiness that never quite reached his eyes, a shadow that she'd always noticed but never fully understood until now. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Been thinking about what you said. Grandpa's been talking about James more lately. Maybe it's a sign." As dawn broke over the city, Sarah had made her decision. She would go to the Veterans Association as soon as they opened, then track down James. She couldn't let another day pass with these two men living with their private grief, not when healing was within reach. She got Emma ready for school, her mind already rehearsing what she would say when she found James again. This time, she wouldn't let him disappear into the crowd. This time, she would make sure 50 years of silence finally came to an end. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the marble halls of the Vietnam Veterans Association building early that morning. The place smelled of old paper and coffee, with walls covered in faded photographs of young men in uniform. Her heart raced as she approached the front desk, where an elderly volunteer looked up from his crossword puzzle. "I'm looking for information about James Cooper," she said, placing the hastily written notes from the plane on the counter. "He served in Vietnam, around the same time as my grandfather, Frank Miller." The volunteer's eyes lit up with recognition. "Cooper and Miller?" He set down his pen. "You should talk to Tom Wheeler. He served with both of them." He gestured toward a man arranging old photographs on a bulletin board. Tom Wheeler turned out to be a treasure trove of information. His weathered hands carefully opened a leather-bound album, revealing photographs that made Sarah's breath catch. There they were, James and her grandfather, young and smiling, arms around each other's shoulders in front of a military helicopter. "These two were inseparable," Tom said, his finger tracing the edge of the photograph. "Best damn soldiers in the unit. Until that last mission." His voice trailed off, and Sarah leaned forward, hanging on every word. Tom shared details about the fateful day that separated the two friends. The explosion, the chaos, the miscommunication that led each man to believe the other was lost. As he spoke, Sarah discovered newspaper clippings tucked between the album pages, yellowed with age but preserving the story of that tragic mission. With trembling hands, she copied down James's last known address and phone number from the association's records. The call she made from her car went exactly as she feared. The moment she mentioned Frank's name, the line went dead. The suburban street where James lived was quiet, lined with American flags and well-maintained lawns. His house stood out with its pristine military flag displayed proudly on the front porch. Sarah sat in her car for several minutes, gathering her courage, before walking up the concrete path to his door. The house was modest, but impeccable, with carefully tended flowers in the window boxes. Military memorabilia was visible through the windows: medals, photographs, and what looked like a folded flag in a display case. When James opened the door, his expression shifted from confusion to recognition to fear in rapid succession. Sarah could see he remembered her from the plane, but before she could speak, he started to close the door. "Please," she said, quickly placing her foot in the doorway. "I know about what happened during the mission. I know about you and Frank." James's face paled. "You don't know anything," he said, but his voice wavered. Sarah reached into her purse and retrieved the photograph she'd brought from home, one showing her grandfather at a recent family barbecue. As she held it out, her hands shaking slightly, the photo slipped from her fingers, landing face up on the welcome mat. James stared at the image, and Sarah could see the years of guilt and pain etched in the lines of his face. His hand trembled as he bent to pick up the photograph, his eyes never leaving Frank's familiar features. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "How is he?" Sarah watched as James's fingers traced the outline of Frank's face in the photograph. His other hand gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles turned white. "He misses you," she said softly. "He talks about you all the time. He never stopped wondering what happened to you." James's resistance crumbled visibly. He stepped back, opening the door wider, a silent invitation that Sarah accepted. The interior of his home was like a museum dedicated to his military service. Shadow boxes containing medals lined the walls, and photographs of young soldiers filled every available surface. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah nodded, following him into a kitchen that looked frozen in time, with appliances from decades past still in perfect working order. As James busied himself with the coffee maker, Sarah noticed a particular photograph prominently displayed on the refrigerator. It showed James and Frank, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a helicopter. It was the same image she'd seen in the Veterans Association album. That was taken 2 days before. James's voice trailed off as he handed her a steaming mug. "I thought he blamed me. I was the one who suggested we take that route. If we'd gone the other way..." Sarah pulled out her phone and pulled up a video she'd recorded at last year's Thanksgiving. In it, her grandfather was telling stories to the grandchildren, and his voice filled the kitchen. "James Cooper was the finest soldier I ever knew. I've never forgiven myself for leaving him behind that day." James sank into a chair, tears streaming down his face as he watched Frank on the small screen. "He thinks he left me behind? I was the one who..." He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. Sarah found newspaper clippings scattered across his desk, all mentioning Frank's name. Some were recent. Community service awards, charity work, family celebrations. James had been following his friend's life from afar all these years. "He's been looking for you too," Sarah said, pulling out the military diary she'd brought. "He writes about you in here, about how much he misses his best friend." James reached for the diary with trembling hands when suddenly Sarah's phone rang. The screen displayed Grandpa Frank. James's eyes widened in panic, and he practically jumped from his chair. "I can't," he whispered, backing away. "I'm not ready. I can't face him yet." Sarah quickly declined the call, but the damage was done. James had retreated into himself, the walls going back up. But she'd seen enough to know that beneath the fear and guilt, there was still a deep love for his old friend. "Tomorrow," she said firmly. "We're going to fix this tomorrow, before another 50 years pass." Sarah stood in James's living room, surrounded by the weight of 50 years of memories. Military medals lined the walls, their brass surfaces catching the afternoon light. James's hands trembled as he gestured for her to take a seat, his eyes never leaving the old photograph of Frank that had fallen from her purse. "He looks different now," Sarah said softly, pulling out her phone. "Would you like to see?" She pulled up a recent video of her grandfather at his last birthday party. James sank into his armchair, his weathered face a canvas of emotions as he watched Frank, now gray-haired, but still sporting the same warm smile, surrounded by family. "I never thought..." James's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I never thought I'd see him again, even in a video." Sarah watched as tears formed in the old soldier's eyes. The tough exterior he'd maintained on the plane was crumbling, revealing the deep well of pain beneath. She waited, knowing some stories needed time to surface. "That day," James began, his voice barely above a whisper, "that cursed day in the jungle." He closed his eyes and Sarah could see him traveling back through time, back to the heat and chaos of Vietnam. "We were supposed to secure a village," he continued. "Intelligence said it was clear, but I had a feeling. Something wasn't right. I should have told Frank to wait, to call for backup. But I didn't. I was young, stupid, eager to prove myself." Sarah leaned forward, finally hearing the story her grandfather had never been able to tell completely. James's words painted a vivid picture of that fateful day. The humidity, the tension, the sudden explosion that tore through their unit. "I gave the order to advance," James said, his voice heavy with decades of self-recrimination. "The blast. I saw Frank go down. There was so much smoke, so much confusion. When I regained consciousness, they told me they couldn't find him. I searched until they dragged me away." Sarah pulled out her grandfather's medal, identical to the one James wore. "He blamed himself too," she said quietly. "All these years he thought he had abandoned you. He thought you were dead, but he never forgave himself for not searching longer." James looked up sharply, disbelief etched across his features. "He blamed himself?" Sarah nodded, reaching into her bag for more photos. "He kept everything, every memory, every picture. He named his son James. Did you know that? My uncle." The old veteran's hands shook as he accepted the stack of photographs. Each image seemed to chip away at the wall he'd built around his heart. There were pictures of their unit, young men smiling despite the war around them. Frank and James, arms around each other's shoulders, their futures still bright with possibility. The sound of a phone ringing shattered the moment. Sarah's heart jumped when she saw her grandfather's name on the screen. James's face went pale, and he quickly turned away, panic replacing the vulnerability of moments before. "I can't," he whispered. "Not yet." Sarah answered the call, moving to the kitchen to make up an excuse about her whereabouts. When she returned, James was standing by his wall of medals, staring at them as if seeing them for the first time. "Frank never blamed you," Sarah said softly. "He missed his friend. That's all. For 50 years he's just missed his friend." James touched his medal, his fingers tracing the familiar contours. "I've replayed that day 1,000 times," he said. "Imagined what I should have done differently. I couldn't face him, knowing my decision almost got him killed." "But it didn't," Sarah pressed. "You both survived. You both lived good lives. Don't you think it's time to stop punishing yourself?" The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room. James turned to Sarah, and for the first time she saw a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. "Tomorrow," said Sarah. "We're going to do this tomorrow before another 50 years pass." James sank back into his chair, running his hands through his silver hair. "How?" he asked. "How do you just walk up to someone after 50 years and say, 'I'm sorry'?" Sarah pulled out her phone again, scrolling through more recent photos of her grandfather. "Look at him, James. Look at how he smiles when he tells stories about you. He keeps your picture in his wallet. Did you know that? A worn, creased photo of you two before the explosion." The old veteran's eyes welled up again as Sarah showed him more images. Frank at family gatherings, always touching the medal he wore, the same one James had. In every photo, there was a hint of sadness behind his smile, a shadow that Sarah now understood completely. "I have nightmares sometimes," James admitted. "About the explosion, about leaving him behind. I wake up hearing the sounds, smelling the smoke." He stood up slowly, walking to a small desk in the corner. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out a leather-bound journal. "I wrote to him," James said, opening the journal with careful fingers. "Letters I never sent. Every year on the anniversary of that day, I wrote to him, telling him how sorry I was, how I should have known better, how I failed him as a commanding officer and as a friend." Sarah reached for the journal, and James handed it to her with trembling hands. The pages were filled with decades of guilt, of longing, of a friendship frozen in time by a single moment of chaos. "My grandfather has one too," Sarah said softly. "A box full of letters to you. He writes about the jokes you shared, the promises you made to visit each other's families after the war. He writes about how much he misses his best friend." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the room in warm oranges and deep shadows. James walked to the window, his silhouette stark against the fading light. "Where?" he asked finally. Where should we meet? Sarah stood, hope rising in her chest. There's a small cafe near his house. Quiet, private. We can go tomorrow morning. James nodded slowly, his shoulders straightening slightly as if a fraction of his burden had already lifted. Will you... He paused, swallowing hard. Will you be there? Every step of the way, Sarah promised, touching his arm gently. It's time to come home, James. It's time to let the war end. As she prepared to leave, James stopped her at the door. He unclipped the medal from his jacket, holding it like a precious treasure. I wore this every day, he said, to remember. Maybe tomorrow, it can help me forget instead. The streetlights were coming on as Sarah walked to her car, her heart full of hope and fear in equal measure. She looked back to see James standing in his doorway, the medal clutched in his hand, looking somehow both older and younger in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow, said Sarah. We're going to do this tomorrow, before another 50 years pass. Sarah's hands trembled as she arranged the coffee cups on the corner table at Madison's cafe. She had chosen this location carefully, quiet enough for conversation, but public enough to prevent any dramatic exits. At least, that's what she hoped. The morning sun filtered through the large windows, casting a warm glow that did little to calm her nerves. James arrived 45 minutes early, his military punctuality evident even after all these years. He wore his best button-down shirt and had polished his service pins until they gleamed. Sarah watched him pace near the entrance before finally settling into the chair she had selected, his back to the wall, facing the door. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea, he muttered, straightening his collar for the 10th time. It's the best idea, Sarah assured him, though her own heart was racing. She had orchestrated this meeting down to the smallest detail, telling her grandfather they were just meeting for their usual Wednesday coffee. She checked her phone. Frank would arrive any minute now. James kept glancing at the door, his fingers drumming an irregular rhythm on the wooden table. The waitress had already refilled his water twice, and he hadn't touched a drop. Sarah could see the war playing out behind his eyes, 50 years of rehearsed conversations competing with the urge to flee. Through the window, she spotted her grandfather's familiar gait. Frank Miller walked with the same military bearing he'd maintained all his life, though his steps were slower now. Sarah felt her throat tighten. This was it. James saw him too. His face drained of color as Frank approached the cafe entrance. Their eyes met through the glass, and for a split second, time seemed to stop. Frank's expression shifted from casual to shocked recognition, his hand freezing on the door handle. Before Sarah could react, James was up and moving. He knocked over his chair in his haste, surprising nearby patrons. I can't, he choked out. I'm sorry, I just can't. He bolted toward the kitchen, shouldering past a startled waiter. Sarah jumped up, torn between following James and greeting her grandfather, who now stood bewildered in the doorway. Grandpa, That was Jimmy Cooper, wasn't it? Frank's voice was barely a whisper. His eyes were fixed on the swinging kitchen door, a mixture of shock and longing etched into every line of his face. Sarah nodded, her carefully laid plans crumbling around her. She watched as her grandfather sank into a chair, his hands shaking as he reached for the water glass James had left untouched. How? He asked simply. Sarah tried calling James's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She explained everything to her grandfather, the chance meeting on the plane, the discoveries she'd made, and her attempts to bring them together. Frank listened in silence, occasionally wiping at his eyes. After leaving the cafe, Sarah drove straight to James's house. She found him sitting on his front porch, looking defeated. I'm a coward, he said before she could speak. All these years I told myself I stayed away because I was protecting him from the truth. But I'm just a coward. You're not a coward, Sarah insisted, sitting beside him. You're human. And so is he. He's hurting just as much as you are. James shook his head, pulling out his wallet and removing a worn photograph. "I've carried this picture every day since Saigon," he said. "Every single day I've looked at it and wondered what I'd say if I ever saw him again. Then the moment comes, and I run away like a scared kid." An unexpected revelation surfaced during their conversation on the porch, something James had never told anyone about that last day in Vietnam, something that changed everything. "I have something to show you," Sarah said, reaching into her bag for her grandfather's military journal. James stared at the worn leather journal, his hands trembling as Sarah held it out. The faded name Frank Miller was still visible on its cover, the letters pressed deep into the material decades ago. "He wrote about you," Sarah said softly. "Almost every day after the explosion. He never stopped writing about you." James accepted the journal with the reverence of someone handling sacred text. His weathered fingers traced the familiar handwriting, and tears began forming in his eyes as he read the first entry Sarah had bookmarked. "Today I lost more than a brother in arms," James read aloud, his voice cracking. "I lost part of my soul. The brass says Jimmy's gone, but I can't accept it. Won't accept it. A man knows when his best friend is truly gone, and I don't feel it. I'll carry his memory and his friendship until I find him again." Sarah watched as James turned page after page, reading entries that spoke of guilt, loss, and an undying friendship. His shoulders began to shake as he reached an entry from Christmas 1969. "Brought out the chess set today," he read. "The one Jimmy and I used to play with during downtime. Nobody plays with me anymore. They all know that's Jimmy's seat across the board. Always will be." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch as James continued reading, each entry revealing the depth of Frank's loss and his unwavering loyalty to their friendship. The truth was there in black and white. Frank had never blamed James for anything. He had only missed his friend. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her grandfather. "Is he okay?" James noticed the text. "He always did worry too much," he said with a sad smile. "Even in the jungle, he'd fuss over everyone like a mother hen." "He still does," Sarah replied, "and he still has your chess set." James closed the journal carefully, his decision visible in the straightening of his spine and the squaring of his shoulders. "I need to see him," he said firmly. "Not tomorrow, not next week. Now." Sarah nodded, already dialing her grandfather's number. When Frank answered, James spoke for the first time in 50 years to his best friend. "Frank? It's Jimmy. I'm sorry I ran. Can we try again?" The silence on the other end lasted only a moment before Frank's voice, thick with emotion, came through. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. "I have something to show you first," said Sarah, pulling a tattered military diary from her bag. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her grandfather's war diary from her bag. The leather-bound journal was worn, its pages yellowed with time, but the words inside held the power to bridge 5 decades of silence. James sat across from her in his dimly lit living room, his eyes fixed on the familiar handwriting that emerged as she opened it. "I found this last week, while helping Grandpa organize his study," Sarah said softly. "I think you need to hear what's in here." James leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. The first entry Sarah read was dated just days after the explosion that had torn the two friends apart. Frank's words flowed with raw emotion. "I can't stop thinking about James. The medics say there's no way he could have survived that blast, but I refuse to believe it. I should have searched longer. I should have stayed." Tears welled in James's eyes as Sarah continued reading. Page after page revealed Frank's profound grief, his guilt, and most importantly, his unwavering friendship. There was no blame, no anger, only loss and love for a brother in arms. "Listen to this," Sarah said, turning to an entry from 6 months after the incident. "I earned another medal today. All I could think about was how James should have been here to receive his too. He was always the better soldier, The braver one. I'm only standing here because of him. James stood abruptly, walking to his window. His shoulders shook slightly as he struggled to maintain composure. He thought I was the brave one, he whispered. I was the one who made the mistake that day. I was the one who... His voice trailed off. Sarah followed him, diary still in hand. There's more, she said. So much more. As she read entry after entry, the weight of decades seemed to lift gradually from James's shoulders. Frank's words painted a picture not of betrayal or disappointment, but of deep brotherhood and endless respect. The diary spoke of countless nights spent wondering where James was, if he had somehow survived, and why they had never found each other again. The ringing of a phone cut through the emotional moment. James froze as he saw Frank's number appearing on Sarah's phone screen. She had planned this, timing the call perfectly with the diary reading. James stared at the phone, paralyzed. Sarah held it out to him, her hand steady. He's been waiting 50 years to hear your voice, she said quietly. With trembling fingers, James took the phone. His hello was barely audible, but the response from the other end was immediate. Frank's voice, aged but unmistakable, filled the silence. Their conversation started hesitantly, both men struggling to find words big enough to span the decades between them. But as minutes passed, their voices grew stronger, more confident. They shared brief memories, careful not to delve too deep too quickly. Sarah watched as James's face transformed. The guilt that had aged him beyond his years seemed to fade with each word exchanged. He pulled out old photographs from his wallet, describing them to Frank as if they were sitting together. When they finally arranged to meet in person, James's smile was genuine, though tinged with nervousness. The call ended with a promise: no more running, no more hiding. After hanging up, James carefully picked up the diary again, running his fingers over Frank's handwriting. I never knew, he said. All these years I thought he blamed me. I thought... Sarah placed her hand over his. You both carried guilt you didn't deserve, but now you have a chance to make it right. They spent the next hour planning the meeting, choosing a place that held meaning for both veterans. James insisted on wearing his medal, the same one that had caught Sarah's attention on the plane. As evening approached, Sarah watched James standing straighter, looking younger than he had when she first met him. The diary had done what 50 years of silence couldn't. It had shown him the truth that had been waiting all along. 50 years of absence were about to end in an embrace. Sarah helped James select the proper attire for tomorrow's meeting, noting how his hands shook less now as he pulled out his old service jacket from the closet. The metals clinked softly against each other as he pinned them in place, each one carrying its own story of brotherhood and sacrifice. Frank always said I polished these too much. James chuckled softly, running his finger over the gleaming surface of his combat infantry badge. He used to tell me they'd blind the enemy before we could even get a shot off. The evening light filtered through James's windows as they continued preparations. He pulled out more photographs, each one carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. There was one of Frank and him standing beside their tent, arms thrown around each other's shoulders, their young faces beaming with confidence. Another showed them receiving commendations, standing at attention, but failing to hide their proud grins. We were just kids, James murmured, touching the faces in the photographs. So damn young and sure we were invincible. Sarah watched as he gathered the photos into a small album to take tomorrow. His movements were more purposeful now, the hesitation from earlier replaced by quiet determination. The diary lay open on his coffee table, Frank's words still visible on the yellowed pages. What time should I pick you up tomorrow? Sarah asked, checking her phone for the 20th time to ensure Frank's messages confirmed everything was still on track. 800 hours, James replied automatically, then smiled at his use of military time. Sorry, old habits. 8 o'clock will be fine. That'll give me time to... He paused, taking a deep breath. To be ready. As Sarah prepared to leave, James stopped her at the door. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not letting me run again, for bringing his words to me." She hugged him gently, feeling the strength return to his frame. "Just promise me one thing," she said. "Promise me you'll let him say everything he's been waiting 50 years to say." James nodded, standing straighter in his doorway. "Roger that," he whispered, a tear sliding down his cheek as he smiled. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Sarah watched from her car as James Cooper's silver sedan pulled into the coffee shop parking lot. Her heart raced as she noticed his trembling hands on the steering wheel. He sat there for several minutes, gripping the wheel, before finally gathering the courage to step out. He was wearing his best suit, his military medal prominently displayed on his lapel. 15 minutes later, Frank's car appeared. Sarah held her breath as her grandfather emerged, also wearing his formal attire, his own medal catching the morning sunlight. The moment froze in time as the two veterans caught sight of each other across the parking lot. James stood rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with recognition and emotion. Frank stopped mid-step, his mouth slightly open. 50 years melted away in that instant, and they were no longer two elderly men but young soldiers again, brothers in arms who had lost each other in the chaos of war. Frank moved first, taking slow, deliberate steps toward his long-lost friend. James remained frozen, tears already streaming down his weathered face. When they were just a few feet apart, Frank opened his arms without hesitation. "Jimmy," he whispered, his voice breaking. The dam burst. James collapsed into his friend's embrace, both men holding each other as if afraid the other might disappear again. Their sobs were quiet but powerful, 5 decades of guilt, grief, and longing pouring out in that single moment. "I thought you were dead," Frank choked out. "All these years." "I'm sorry," James repeated over and over. "I'm so sorry, Frank. I should have looked for you, I should have." They stayed like that for what seemed like eternity, other patrons of the coffee shop discreetly averting their eyes from the powerful scene unfolding in the parking lot. Sarah watched through tears of her own as the two men finally separated, both wiping their eyes with handkerchiefs. Inside the coffee shop, they chose a quiet corner booth. Their hands shook as they sipped their coffee, neither quite knowing where to begin. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a faded photograph. "I've carried this every day since Saigon," he said, sliding it across the table. Frank's breath caught as he recognized the image. 2 young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera in front of their tent. "I have the same one," he said, producing an identical, equally worn photo from his own wallet. The stories began to flow then, memories both painful and precious spilling out. They talked about the explosion, each revealing their version of events, finally understanding how misunderstanding and guilt had kept them apart for so long. "I thought you'd blame me," James admitted. "I gave the wrong coordinates that day." Frank shook his head vigorously. "I blame myself for leaving you behind. The medic said you were gone, but I should have checked myself. I should have." "We were kids," James said softly. "Just kids in an impossible situation." They shared stories of their lives after Vietnam, marriages, children, grandchildren. James pulled out his phone to show pictures of his family, while Frank proudly displayed photos of his own grandkids. They discovered they had both stayed in the same state all these years, living less than 2 hours apart. "All this time," Frank marveled. "You were so close." "We have time now," James said firmly. "If you want to." "Every Sunday," Frank interrupted. "You'll come for dinner every Sunday. No more wasted time." They exchanged phone numbers, made plans for the following weekend, and promised to bring their families together. As they stood to leave, both men reached for their medals simultaneously. "Keep it," they said in unison, each trying to hand their medal to the other. They laughed, the sound of true joy filling the coffee shop. Sarah watched as they walked out together, shoulders straight, steps lighter than when they had arrived. They looked like soldiers again, but this time they were marching toward peace instead of war. As the two veterans walked away from the cafe together, Sarah realized her mission hadn't ended. It was just beginning. The next morning dawned bright and crisp, carrying the promise of new beginnings. Sarah woke to a text message from James, a photo of him and Frank at a local diner, having breakfast together. They couldn't wait for Sunday, it seemed. She watched through social media as both families exploded with excitement over the news. James's daughter had posted a tearful video about her father smiling for the first time in years. Frank's granddaughter shared an old war photo, finally putting a face to all the stories she'd grown up hearing about Uncle Jimmy. The following days brought a flurry of activity. Both men called Sarah multiple times, sharing their plans for the upcoming family gathering. Frank insisted on hosting at his house, while James was already talking about Christmas plans, despite it being months away. "We've got 5 decades to make up for," he told Sarah during one call. "Every holiday, every birthday, every moment we missed." On Thursday, Sarah drove by Frank's house to drop off some old photo albums her grandmother had kept. She found the two veterans in the garage, surrounded by boxes of memorabilia. They were like schoolboys, excitedly showing each other treasures from their past. Letters, badges, even their old dog tags. "Look what I found," Frank called out to her, holding up a tattered piece of paper. It was a permission slip they'd both signed to go on a weekend pass to Saigon, dated just weeks before the explosion that tore them apart. "We were going to get matching tattoos," he chuckled. "Never made it to that appointment." James grinned, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a faded eagle on his forearm. "I got mine anyway, 2 years later. Always hoped I'd run into you and you'd get yours too." "Well," Frank said, his eyes twinkling, "there's a parlor downtown that does great work. My grandson got his done there." Sarah left them planning their tattoo adventure, their laughter following her to her car. As she drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror to see them standing side by side in the driveway, 2 old soldiers who had finally found their way home to each other. The Sunday family dinner was approaching fast, and with it, the promise of 2 families becoming one, all because of a simple seat switch on an airplane. Life, Sarah realized, had a beautiful way of bringing people full circle. Sarah spent the entire morning helping her mother prepare for what would become one of the most meaningful family gatherings they'd ever hosted. The aroma of roasted chicken and fresh-baked bread filled the Miller household as she arranged the dining room table, carefully placing old military photographs alongside the centerpieces. The doorbell rang just before noon. James stood there, clutching a worn leather photo album, his eyes betraying a mix of nervousness and excitement. Behind him, his daughter and grandchildren waited, each carrying covered dishes and uncertain smiles. Sarah welcomed them warmly, noting how James's shoulders relaxed as he stepped into the house. Minutes later, Frank emerged from his favorite armchair to greet his long-lost friend. The 2 veterans embraced briefly before James began introducing his family. "This is my daughter, Patricia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And these are my grandkids, Tommy and Claire." Frank's eyes lit up as he shook their hands, immediately launching into a story about their grandfather's bravery during a particularly challenging mission. The atmosphere transformed as more family members arrived. Frank's children and grandchildren filtered in, each bringing their own dishes and curiosity about the man they'd heard about only in whispered conversations and seen in faded photographs. The living room soon buzzed with conversation, bridging 50 years of separate lives. "Look at this," James said, opening his photo album on the coffee table. A crowd gathered as he pointed to a yellowed photograph of 2 young soldiers standing beside a helicopter. "That was the day before our first major operation." Children and adults alike leaned in, fascinated by the images of their grandfathers in their youth. Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway as new photographs were taken. James and Frank recreating their old military poses, this time with their grandchildren mimicking them. Laughter echoed through the house as stories flowed freely, decades of missed moments being recovered through shared memories. During lunch, James's grandson Tommy presented both veterans with hand-drawn pictures of helicopters. "Grandpa said you guys were the best pilots," he announced proudly. The old friends exchanged glances, their eyes glistening. "Your grandfather," Frank began, addressing Tommy, "saved my life more times than I can count. Did he ever tell you about the time we had to land in complete darkness during a storm?" The children gathered closer, hanging on every word as Frank and James took turns filling in details of their shared adventures. Sarah's mother brought out a special dessert, a cake decorated with both men's old unit insignia. The gesture brought tears to James's eyes. "I never thought I'd see this again," he said softly, touching the familiar symbol. As the afternoon progressed, plans for future gatherings began to take shape. "You must come fishing with us next weekend," Frank insisted, looking at James's family. "The lake's perfect this time of year." Patricia immediately pulled out her phone to coordinate with Frank's daughters, while the grandchildren excitedly discussed sharing video games and sports equipment. The healing was visible in every interaction. Where there had once been a void, new connections sprouted and flourished. Sarah observed how her cousin's kids naturally gravitated toward James's grandchildren, their laughter a testament to how easily young hearts forge bonds. Standing together near the fireplace, James and Frank raised their glasses in a toast. "To Sarah," James announced, "who reminded us that it's never too late to rebuild what was lost." All eyes turned to her, and Sarah felt the weight of their gratitude. "To family," Frank added, "both old and new." As the day wound down, promises to keep in touch were exchanged, but these weren't the polite, empty words often spoken at gatherings. Phone numbers were programmed into devices, social media connections were made, and concrete plans were set for next week's activities. Before leaving, James and Frank stood together for one final photograph, this time surrounded by their entire extended family. 3 generations of Coopers and Millers squeezed into the frame, their smiles genuine and bright. The picture would soon hang in both houses, a testament to the power of reconciliation and the strength of family bonds. What had started as a simple seat exchange on an airplane had transformed into something far greater than Sarah could have imagined. As the families gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Sarah noticed James lingering near the wall of family photos in the hallway. He stood transfixed before a recent picture of Frank with his great-granddaughter at her baptism. "I miss so many moments," he whispered when Sarah approached. "But looking at all of this, these beautiful families we've built, maybe it was worth the wait to appreciate it even more." The goodbyes took nearly an hour, with each new plan and promise extending the farewell. The children had to be practically dragged away from their newfound cousins, while the adults exchanged recipes and contact information. Patricia and Frank's daughter Lisa had already created a family group chat, pinging with messages about next weekend's fishing trip. James paused at the doorway, turning to Frank. "Remember how we used to say we'd grow old together telling war stories to our grandkids?" His voice cracked slightly. "Looks like we'll get to do that after all." Frank pulled his friend into another embrace. "Better late than never, brother. Better late than never." The evening sun cast long shadows across the Millers' front lawn as cars filled with both families pulled away. Sarah stood between her grandfather and James, watching as headlights disappeared around the corner. The 3 remained in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts about how a single day had rewritten decades of separation. "You know," Frank said, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder, "some angels wear business suits and carry boarding passes." The soft autumn breeze carried the sound of distant laughter, a promise of many more gatherings to come, many more stories to share, and many more bonds to strengthen. What had begun as two separate family trees had now intertwined their branches, creating a canopy of connection that would shelter generations to come. Sarah stood by the window of her parents' house, watching James and Frank sitting side by side in camping chairs by the lake, their fishing lines cast into the calm water. The morning sun painted their white hair golden, and their laughter carried across the distance. It was hard to believe that just months ago, these two men had been separated by decades of guilt and misunderstanding. The weekly fishing sessions had become a sacred ritual, just like their Sunday morning breakfasts at Frank's house. Sarah's grandmother had to set up a larger table to accommodate both families, but she did so with joy in her heart, watching her husband come alive again in the presence of his long-lost friend. Every holiday now felt different, fuller somehow. Last Thanksgiving, James brought his famous pecan pie, a recipe he'd learned in Louisiana after the war. Christmas saw both families gathering around a tree decorated with ornaments that told the story of both their lives, including two special medallions hanging side by side on the highest branches. Sarah loved watching James with Frank's great-grandchildren. The old veteran had a special gift for storytelling, and the kids would gather around him, wide-eyed, as he shared tales of their grandfather's bravery. He'd learned to tell the stories differently now, without the weight of guilt that had colored them for so long. The children particularly loved the story of how their families reconnected, always asking Sarah to tell them about the airplane seat switch that changed everything. The transformation in both men was remarkable. Frank's persistent nightmares had subsided, and James had finally unpacked the boxes of memories he'd kept sealed in his attic. Together they sorted through photographs, newspaper clippings, and letters, creating a shared archive of their history. New photos joined the old ones on their walls: birthday celebrations, barbecues, fishing trips, and quiet moments of two old friends simply enjoying each other's company. They'd even started planning a trip together to Washington, D.C. to visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It would be their first time going together, a journey they'd both avoided for different reasons over the years. Now, they felt ready to face those memories as a team, just like they had in their youth. Sarah observed how their reunion had rippled through both families. Frank's son had helped James repair his roof last summer, and James's daughter now taught piano to Frank's granddaughter. The families had woven together naturally, as if making up for lost time. At the last veterans ceremony in town, James and Frank stood side by side, their medals gleaming in the sun. The local paper ran a story about their reunion, inspiring other veterans to reach out to long-lost comrades. Their story had taken on a life of its own, showing others that it's never too late for reconciliation. The lesson about forgiveness and second chances hadn't been lost on the younger generations. Sarah's daughter, only 6, already understood the importance of kindness in a way that surprised everyone. "Sometimes," she'd said, watching the two veterans dozing in adjacent rocking chairs, "you just have to be nice and magic happens." Their medals, once kept hidden away in drawers and boxes, now hung proudly side by side in a custom-made display case in Frank's study. Beneath them lay the airline ticket stub that Sarah had kept, a humble reminder of how their lives had changed with one simple act of kindness. As the sun began to set, Sarah watched James and Frank pack up their fishing gear, their movements synchronized by months of shared routine. They helped each other up, shoulders touching, sharing one last joke before heading back to the house. Their daily goodbye had become a ritual in itself, a firm handshake that turned into a hug, followed by a promise to meet again tomorrow. Looking at them now, Sarah could hardly believe there had ever been a time when these two men had lived separate lives, carrying their private burdens of guilt and regret. Their story had taught her something profound about the nature of healing and the power of simple acts of kindness. In a world that often seemed cold and distant, Sarah had learned that a simple act of kindness could span decades, heal hearts, and reconnect souls long separated, all starting with the offer of an airplane seat. That evening, as Sarah helped clean up after another shared family dinner, she found herself pausing over an old photograph that had been placed on Frank's mantel. It showed the two young soldiers in Vietnam, arms around each other's shoulders, their faces untouched by the weight of the years to come. Next to it stood a new photo, taken just last week, showing them in the same pose. Older, wiser, but with the same brotherly affection shining in their eyes. James had recently moved to a house just 3 blocks away from Frank's, claiming it was to be closer to the good fishing spots, though everyone knew the real reason. Their morning coffee ritual had become legendary in the neighborhood, 2 elderly veterans sitting on Frank's porch, solving the world's problems 1 cup at a time. The healing had extended beyond just the 2 of them. Frank's wife mentioned how his nightmares had all but disappeared, and James's daughter said her father smiled more in the past few months than she'd seen in years. The weight of unspoken words and hidden guilt had lifted, replaced by the comfortable silence of old friends who had finally found their way back to each other. During last week's barbecue, Sarah overheard James telling Frank's youngest great-grandson about their time in basic training, the story punctuated with laughter rather than the usual shadows of pain. The boy sat enthralled, his eyes wide as James described how Frank had once saved their entire unit by remembering an old joke at exactly the right moment. Sarah watched as both families naturally gravitated toward each other at every gathering, filling in the 50-year gap with new memories. James's granddaughter was planning her wedding now, and without hesitation, she had asked both veterans to walk her down the aisle together, a symbol of the unbreakable bond between their families. They had even started a tradition of Saturday morning breakfast at the local diner, where other veterans would often stop by their table, drawn by the visible joy of their reconnection. Their story had become a beacon of hope in their small community, a reminder that it's never too late for reconciliation and healing. The last time Sarah visited, she found them in Frank's garage, methodically organizing their war memorabilia into a joint collection. Their medals, photos, and letters were being carefully preserved, not just as artifacts of war, but as testimonies to the enduring power of friendship and forgiveness. As winter approached, both men talked about writing their story down for future generations. Not just the war stories, but the story of how a chance encounter on an airplane had brought them full circle, proving that even the smallest gesture of kindness could bridge the widest gaps of time and heal the deepest wounds. Yesterday, Sarah had watched them teaching Frank's great-granddaughter how to tie fishing knots, both men's weathered hands guiding the child's small ones with infinite patience. In that moment, she saw the future they had almost lost, generations connected, wisdom passed down, love multiplied. Now, watching them wave goodbye after another evening together, Sarah knew that some miracles don't announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the simple gesture of offering a stranger your airplane seat, setting in motion a healing that reaches far beyond what any one person could imagine.